Welcome to the Health Edge, translating the science of self-care. I'm Mark Pettis with my friend, colleague, John Bagnulo. John, good morning, my friend.
Hey, good morning, Mark. Great to see you, bud.
Great to see you. We're into the new year and have a great paper to review with our listeners today, John, that um, makes some really important points, many of which that I think we emphasize and have through the years. But one of the points that this study will emphasize is that long before disease manifests, long before we have a diagnostic test to label whatever you're going through a disease like diabetes, a high blood sugar, or a high hemoglobin A1C, long before you get to that point, you can see very significant changes in cellular function, metabolism, and we've been on this theme of metabolic health. And this paper really opened my eyes to how profound in people who are otherwise at a good body weight and have no diabetes history can have changes that clearly have them on a trajectory of chronic complex disease, particularly diabetes, insulin resistance, these passports to aging and diminished quality of life. And the paper, as we'll see, makes this distinction between people who are sedentary, and these are young adults, versus people who are active as defined by meeting the current recommendation standards for activity, which we've touched on in recent podcasts of 150 minutes a week of moderate activity. And this was a very revealing study. It'll be fun to share this. And there's some geek level biochemistry that we always love talking about. So I'm going to, if that sounds okay, John, I'll throw up some slides here. I'm just going to share the screen.
Sounds perfect. And again, just for our listeners' sake, I think that the real startling, if you will, part of all this is that you're talking, I think, about 20, right? There's 20 subjects in the study, 10 considered moderately active and 10 considered sedentary. But to your point, Mark, the 10 that were sedentary, and the authors put the word healthy in quotes, throughout the paper. They were healthy because, decent BMI, no abnormal blood work, no signs of pre-diabetes. And, these are subjects that would have left their annual physical being told, hey, everything looks good,
Exactly.
And so I think, the fact that this paper is looking at quote unquote healthy adults and finding these pathological changes that we'll get into now, it's, we could look back on this paper as being a landmark paper, 5 or 10 years from now.
Absolutely. Okay, let me just bring this up. So we have to start, John, by just briefly
absolutely.
I could not resist putting this graphic up, and I apologize for those who are listening. All of these slides will be on our website, healthedgepodcast.com, and we have a YouTube channel as well. But I think many of our listeners will know that the dietary guidelines for Americans has just been published. These are guidelines that go back to 1970s, John. 50 years.
Even before then in some ways.
And they're updated every 5 years. And they really, perhaps more than any consensus guidelines that we see in the public health community, this probably influences how people perceive what's good for them and not, more than any, as it relates to food. And so this is what came out this week. And it's for those who can't see it, it's kind of a reverse pyramid from the old pyramid, food pyramid that we can all recall. And I guess it's true, John, that sometimes hell does freeze over. It's it's just amazing that we
Yeah.
see this new emphasis on red meats, whole fat dairy, fish, eggs, butter.
And vegetables to be, to be fair here, it's
Yeah,
great. They're not in the, if you look at this, and the thing I like the best, really, or most about this is that the whole thing got turned upside down. I think, I'm sure that was intentional to turn the pyramid upside down as it is, and to get grains down there in the, very limited number of servings per day, right? I mean, that's a huge win. And I know, for our listeners, again, I always say to people, like, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So regardless of your political affiliation, and that's the unfortunate part about this, is it will probably become political on some level, one camp versus the other. And rather than the science behind this, and the science behind this is, it's massive. I would say it's, night and day difference between the science that supports this way of eating, these recommendations, compared to the lack of science that supported the previous food guide pyramid, largely established by the big food groups, and processed food, the processed food industry. So, yeah, Mark, this is like you said, we're literally seeing hell freeze over here.
and that was such a great synopsis, what you just said, John. The evidence to support this has been around for many, many years. We talk about it on most of our podcasts. It has defined many of the nutritional principles. Obviously, whole foods is the emphasis, but with greater emphasis on protein, particularly quality bioavailable protein from animal sources. Um, some emphasis on the need, if you're vegetarian or vegan, to be thinking about inevitable deficiencies. It was a guideline that I think more closely approximates where the research has been, as you said, John, for a long, long time. And so, undoubtedly, there'll be pushback, but
Yeah.
I think it takes a lot of gonadal integrity
Yeah.
for RFK Jr. and a lot of his team that they take, they take a lot of shit,
Yeah.
uh, and yet, within that sort of conflicted political landscape, there's very, very good science, and I think any person who shifts from what may have been the more traditional guidelines to something like this in terms of their day-to-day nutritional roadmap will
Is
realize
gonna They're gonna
very
benefit. Yeah.
significant changes. And hopefully
Yeah.
this will start to help mitigate this overwhelming fear of fat and fear of red meat. And again, the emphasis here is on whole quality foods, and that's the bottom line. But wow, who would have thought?
Yeah.
So this is the study that we've been referencing here, John. It's from University of Colorado. This was published within the last several months. And as you noted, they took a small group of healthy adults, and one group was sedentary, did not really engage in any regular activity. The other group would have been considered active by virtue of their compliance with current guidelines for recommendation. And they looked at the metabolic landscape of these individuals, particularly in their muscles. And this is from my perspective, a really a kind of a sophisticated analysis. The average person, won't volunteer for a muscle biopsy. So they really
Yeah.
got to the cellular mitochondrial level with very sophisticated analytics and histopathology, and so it's really a unique data set in comparing these two groups. And the first thing that came up for me, John, and we alluded to this in our introduction, was the extent to which all of these individuals would have been considered on this early end of this health continuum, where they have no disease, they're considered healthy, they're at what we would consider, based on BMI, that's a whole nother issue. BMI is probably not a very great biomarker in terms of metabolic health. But all of these people would have been considered perfectly healthy. And to your point, John, you would have come away from your visit with a gold star. And we know in the example of diabetes that it's your sugar, your blood sugar, or your hemoglobin A1C that will trigger the diagnosis. And we may call that early stage disease prediabetes in that example. We know that if none of the factors that are driving that change, it will become established type 2 diabetes. And then we know if that trajectory fails to shift, you're looking at just horrendous late stage diseases, from cardiovascular disease to chronic and end stage kidney disease to stroke, liver failure. And so, right, the emphasis is on, okay, if we check a blood sugar, check an A1C, we can prevent more of this and pick up people in these early stages. And what this study shows is that all those things can be normal. A blood sugar and a hemoglobin A1C can be normal. And when you look at a deeper level of metabolic health, you see dramatic disruption, really setting the stage for what will be future clinical diagnoses and obviously clinical problems. And so I just want to remind people of this, the importance that feeling well doesn't necessarily equate to good health. Absence of disease is not equivalent to good health. And we often talk about, John, optimal function. It's really not whether you have disease or not. It's optimizing your biology, not just to mitigate disease risk, but to really allow you to, kick ass in life, to thrive in a modern environment that's toxic, that's changing, that's conflicted, that's, so.
And that, hey, Mark, just real quickly, that's a, great point that you're bringing up here, because for many people, if they don't exercise, if they're not active, they don't really see the limitation in their functionality, in their not being close to optimal health, right? If you never exercise, but you're at a decent weight and you don't have an abnormal blood sugar level, you don't have hyperlipidemia or whatever is going to be the red flag with blood work, when those things don't happen, but you're sedentary, you feel like, hey, everything's going well. Until you go out for a power walk, right? Until you get on the bike and you start to challenge yourself and you're like, wow, am I winded? Wow, why am I feeling all this lactic acid in my legs? I've only been walking for 2 minutes. So I think, to your point, I like the way the author, provides this context where exercise now is like a prescribed intervention instead of being something that people accept to be part of daily life. You always talk in such a great way about the blueprint we have for a certain way of life that our ancestors had. And woven into that was movement throughout the day. Whether you're walking 8 miles or 4 miles, or whether there's high intensity or low intensity, we can debate about the nuances of that activity. But the bottom line is our ancestors moved throughout the day. It wasn't like for a half an hour here or, 3 times a week at this intensity. We moved all the time. And that's really what we have the genetic blueprint for. So the way that the author weaves that into the kind of overall summary of the paper, I found really refreshing. That, we're in a world now where people consider exercise to be an intervention instead of a core component to life, like breathing or eating. It's fascinating, right? It's fascinating how we've lost an appreciation for that as a foundational component of life. And so, to your point, a lot of people don't understand their limitations because they never challenge their body with a faster paced walk, or more time on any whatever piece of equipment it is you want to get on. If you don't push yourself, you don't know that you have limits.
And we are indeed a species with amnesia. It's amazing
Yeah,
how we have
yeah, that's
forgotten
well
where we
said.
come from. It's
Yeah.
yeah, it's great, John. And when you look at just looking at this study, and again, just to sort of remind people, I use diabetes as an example here, because the changes seen in this study that we'll report in a moment really predict future onset of diabetes, of cardiovascular disease, of cognitive decline. Right? These are the early drivers. If you're dealing uh, with a huge fire. We've seen plenty of those in recent years. These are the sparks. This is like ground zero of that happening. And so to be able to see that uh, and then ultimately intervene, not all things that one might see can necessarily be modified. That's not the case here at all. This is all modifiable. So we know that diabetes is epidemic. 1 of 10 Americans, this is type 2 diabetes. This is recent CDC data.
These are really conservative. These are really conservative numbers
They're
too.
conservative
Yeah.
numbers.
To,
And they're
to your
going up
credit,
there.
to your credit, you're giving people a picture that isn't quite as depressing as as you could,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and a lot of this is the way, just to the point of this entire study. So many people walk around out there in society at decent weights, but they're metabolically, right? They're a train wreck. But
Yes.
because they don't have the body weight issue, they don't have the blood sugar levels, and then we're still using fasting glucose, or at best an A1C. If we were using fasting insulin or a HOMA IR score, you'd have 2 to 3 times the number of Americans that would be diagnosed as we do.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a great point, John. And it's one thing that I didn't see was included in the study, because I think you and I would both predict that for those with a normal blood sugar, those with a normal A1C, who would have met criteria for this study because they didn't have evidence of diabetes or pre-diabetes, if you were to look at their insulin levels,
You
and
might find some smoke.
this is on that
Yeah,
pre-disease part, you would definitely see some smoke. And
yeah.
there's good research going back quite a few years looking at insulin patterns, which far precede alterations in glycemic or glucose management and measures. So the HOMA IR is definitely a great test to be getting, particularly if you have a little more weight around the midsection, right? Family history. If you are sedentary, don't don't feel you have to wait for a high blood sugar, because chances are your insulin levels are going to be high, and that is a big red flag. And that, in my experience, John, that can be really motivating. People who might otherwise confront inertia, when they begin to see that, it's like, wow, that is getting my attention. And we connect insulin with virtually every chronic complex
Everything.
disease and accelerated
Yeah.
aging. So this is not a trivial um, factor by any means. So what the study ultimately, they took the sedentary folks and those that were moderately active, and they did muscle biopsies of the quadricep muscles, and they looked at how well the mitochondria were burning oxygen, right? This efficiency, mitochondrial efficiency. They looked at what's called cardiolipin. This is like a phospholipid that makes up the membrane, the cell membrane. But in the mitochondria, there's an inner membrane that cardiolipin tends to be more rich, and we know cardiolipin, that type of fat in those inner mitochondrial membranes, are incredibly health promoting and protective against oxidative stress, and they enhance insulin sensitivity, and they provide kind of a scaffolding for our electron transport chain, right? This flow of electrons, that's really the flow of life.
Yeah.
It guides everything. It's right. So they look at um, protein expression in the muscle, protein synthesis, which is so critical. How well are glucose transporters function? Very sophisticated
Yeah.
analysis.
And just on this slide here, Mark, one thing that is important, because when you see sedentary versus moderately active, I mean, the first thing that came to mind when I was reading through the paper, well, I want to define moderately active, and I want to make sure that I'm not comparing sedentary to highly trained.
Yes.
And the reason that we know these folks were in fact I use the word just, moderately active, to your point, whether it's 2 hours a week or 150 minutes, the bottom line is basically their lactate dehydrogenase levels were the same. So for our listeners' sake, if the moderately active, if the subjects in this study were highly trained, the researchers would have seen differences in the lactate dehydrogenase, LDH levels, right? Because those change when someone is at their anaerobic threshold, right? If that moderately active population, if we're talking about like Olympic caliber, even collegiate runners, let's say, if these people were training an hour a day, 7 days a week, with 15 to 20% of that approaching their anaerobic threshold, then the LDH levels would have been significantly different between these two groups. So I think that's really encouraging, is where I'm going with this, is that, for someone listening to this or someone trying to appreciate this study and the potential for it to improve the health of their mitochondria and overall their metabolic health, it's a moderate amount of exercise we're talking about. It's just not being sedentary. You don't have to be in that, real high intensity window for, 10 or 15 or 20% of whatever duration of exercise you have. You can just go out for a brisk walk, right? And you do that 30 minutes a day, and it takes you out of this sedentary or more, this pathology state. So I just think that was really noteworthy, that the LDH levels were similar, because again, it'd be easy for someone to look at this and say, well, I'm never going to be a highly trained athlete. That's okay. You don't have to be.
Great points, John. And really, you might, from a public health perspective, this would be just the best benchmark for anyone who is sedentary to be moving toward. And as we know, that's doable for the overwhelming majority of people who find themselves just sort of locked into these sedentary lifestyles. This was something that I just wanted to share briefly, that looks at this cardiolipin, which doesn't get a lot of attention in clinical medicine. But these phospholipids in the inner mitochondrial membrane really are kind of the scaffolding for the electron transport chain. And the more active we become, the more efficient our turnover and stabilization of cardiolipin is. We produce more energy. And as we age, and particularly in sedentary states, the whole point of this research paper, we have a drop off in cardiolipin, which they measured, will show that. And you see dramatic drops in energy, bioenergetics, energy production. And that can manifest in many ways, from fatigue, diminished activity tolerance, poor cardiopulmonary health and conditioning. It can manifest as pain, musculoskeletal pain. And so this is such a great distinction and something that they looked at.
Yeah, and in both the quantity of cardiolipin in between these two groups, both the quantity and the quality of the cardiolipin was very, very different between the sedentary and the moderately active. The sedentary had less cardiolipin, which is, to your point, that contributes to the leakiness of the leakiness of the mitochondria, right? And
Right.
one of the best analogies I've heard of for cardiolipin, because it can be I think for some of our listeners, this might be like a somewhat of an abstract term. What is this molecule in our mitochondria? Well, I've always heard that, like, if you think about the mitochondria like an engine, right? You want to have that's an engine that can burn really hot, the mitochondria. It's producing, all of the energy for our body for the most part. You're going to get a little bit from glycolysis, and we can talk about that in a minute, why you don't want to be dependent on that. But you need to have some type of cooling agent that's going to keep everything under control in those engines and not let them overheat and become leaky. And so you want to have really like high viscosity, high quality motor oil in those. And that's kind of what cardiolipin is, right? And there's different versions of it. There's a really cheap, really cheap, kind of low viscosity. It's not going to hold up under high temperatures. And that's the cardiolipin that starts to appear when people are sedentary, when they're producing more of the fat in their body as opposed to acquiring healthier sources of dietary fat. And so you end up with more like palmitic acid in that cardiolipin as opposed to the fats that would come from your diet, and just less cardiolipin overall. And again, I think it's so remarkable to see these pathological changes in what you and I always talk about as if we had to bring it down to what's the most fundamental unit of a person's metabolism that determines whether they're healthy or unhealthy, it's the mitochondria, right? If your mitochondria are leaky, if they're not quick to be turned on, meaning you don't burn fat at any given intensity, you tend to be reliant on carbohydrate metabolism, you don't have that metabolic flexibility, everything goes down the wrong road. And to see that these mitochondria had lower levels of cardiolipin in the sedentary population, and then to look at the molecules of cardiolipin under that electron microscope and see that there's less turnover, there's less of the one that's based more on linoleic acid, and there's one that's the sedentary folks had cardiolipin molecules that were more based on the palmitic acid that their bodies were producing because their insulin levels were probably higher throughout the day. Everything comes together. It's it's just like that mitochondrial impact, so to speak. It's at the confluence of all these different inputs with a sedentary lifestyle maybe being, from what this paper would suggest, the biggest driving factor for that pathology. So yeah, I think cardiolipin's unbelievable. You shared some stuff with me earlier about autoimmune disorders and what kind of has brought cardiolipin to the forefront of research. But I feel like it's going to be the way of the future because there's so much appreciation for mitochondria in cancer and heart disease and every aspect of chronic disease. We keep coming back to mitochondrial health.
Absolutely. There's no escaping it. And we often talk about this concept of the oil change, Sean. I love that. I love that analogy. When it's most people think about fat that they eat, um, ending up being fat in their blood, ending up being fat in their arteries, when in fact, most of the fat in our body is in our cell membranes. Certainly, the brain has a very disproportionate amount of fat, and when you are able to, it sort of brings us back to this new and improved food pyramid. When you start looking at whole, healthy fat sources, many of which will be saturated, and the extent to which they're going to be more resistant to oxidative stress, you're going to improve the health, the resilience, function of all of your cell membranes, and the inner membrane of the mitochondria is a pretty special place. It's got two membranes, right? By every time I look at mitochondrial function, John, I'm brought to my knees with reverence for just how remarkable that biology is, and this quantum level tunneling of electrons and production of energy. It's just such a refined,
It's unbelievable.
It really is pretty impressive. I love the race car analogy. The just to wind down here on a few more of the findings. These were some of the measures that we've talked about already, John. You touched on, they measured, got these folks on a metabolic testing, measuring their oxygen consumption and their carbon dioxide production, looking in the muscle and body wide how they were burning fat and carbohydrate. And we talk a lot about metabolic flexibility, the ability of mitochondria to switch quickly from a carbohydrate base to a fat based fuel source, and how this importance of lactate, being able to clear lactate that is produced from glycolytic level activity, and so they measured all of these things, and it's a bit of a.
And I just want to make sure, Mark, I don't confuse our listeners. Again, the two groups had the same levels of this lactic acid, lactate dehydrogenase. So in theory, if that's all you knew about these two groups, you would say, okay, they're both equally equipped to clear lactic acid from their blood. But obviously the researchers found that was not the case. And that is because of one group, the sedentary group, was producing lactic acid at 3 to 4-fold compared to the active group. So they're producing so much more because they're not using their mitochondria as much as they are glycolysis. So again, for our listeners' sake, I just want to make sure I don't lead to any confusion here when I said that. If you're using glycolysis as the predominant source of energy for the body, it produces massive amounts of lactic acid because it's a dead end street, and some of that pyruvate that gets generated goes back to lactic acid. It's a bidirectional pathway. So your body's going to take pyruvate that's accumulating, that's not being run through the Krebs cycle, or that's not being processed for energy in the mitochondria, and it's going to convert that back to lactic acid. So the lactic acid pool in the body, it grows quickly, even at moderate intensity exercise, when your mitochondria aren't being used. And I think that's really the take home here from the differences in these blood lactate levels, is that the sedentary group just weren't converting any of that pyruvate or any of that, it was a dead end street with their glycolysis. They're producing a small amount of energy by burning sugar outside of the mitochondria, compared to the active group that was readily burning much more of that through their mitochondria, as well as burning much more fat at any given intensity. So again, the lactic acid is huge. It's a fundamental part of this discussion. I just want to make sure our listeners understand that it's not because one group had an increased ability to clear it with a particular enzyme. It's about the massive difference in how much lactic acid was being produced, by the sedentary group compared to the active group. So thanks. I just want to make sure I didn't create confusion.
Perfect summary of this graphic, and really feeds in nicely to the high level findings that certainly compared to those who were sedentary, those who were more active, sedentary folks had much less mitochondrial respiration, as evidenced by these higher lactates, not getting into the Krebs cycle and producing greater amounts of energy. This pyruvate oxidation, again, coming back to your point, John, about this sort of cycling, because you just cannot engage more effective respiration, mitochondrial respiration. They don't burn fat as well, and we know that when you measure beta oxidation of free fatty acids, sedentary people just aren't able to do that. Lactate clearance goes down. You see more reactive oxygen species.
And then it starts to snowball, right, Mark? Because you've got less cardiolipin. You've got cardiolipin that's made out of the wrong fatty acids, so to speak. You got the low viscosity oil. going back to that analogy. So the mitochondria, between the higher levels of reactive oxygen species being generated, poor quality cardiolipin, less of it, the mitochondria, it gets worse, right? And you end up with that mitochondrial myopathy that you might not, you might not have an extreme case of it where it gets diagnosed, but nevertheless, it's a pathology of the mitochondria and it's affecting someone's health.
And when you look at the sort of the phenotype, right, individuals with this level of metabolic or mitochondrial disruption, consuming often abundant calories, because their energy production is down, they're going to be more hungry. And, we know that'll affect their leptin sensitivity. They'll tend to eat more. It's an inability to produce energy, even though you're consuming more quote unquote food.
Yeah, well said.
Right.
Very well said.
So, the big picture is one where you're hungry all the time, you're tired all the time. Your brain isn't locked in, and this becomes a way of life for so many that the assumption is that this is who I am, and I'm kind of stuck here, and just not a very good quality of life. And this, I think, is the last slide, John, with respect to showing that in mitochondrial respiration, you've talked a lot here about glycolysis and this lactate pathway, which is so inefficient, yet where the metabolic driver is in people who are sedentary. And when you measure the Krebs cycle, oxidative metabolism, with all of these byproducts, not surprisingly, from what we've been sharing here, those who are active will tend to have higher levels of these Krebs cycle metabolites because they're getting more fuel into the inner mitochondrial membrane, burning it more effectively, compared to those who are sedentary, who will tend to produce less of those metabolic intermediaries. So these are, I think, all ways of demonstrating just a inability to cycle appropriately. And so, these were just the conclusions of the study. Sedentary individuals had significant decreases in mitochondrial respiration, as well as, their ability to produce energy during resting conditions, compared to those who were moderately active. They had similar glucose
good point.
function here, but they, sedentary individuals just cannot leverage glucose getting into their mitochondria. It'll tend to get shunted into that anaerobic glycolytic pathway. We know that burning fat is a real problem when carbohydrate is your predominant fuel source. And again, your ability to clear lactate is impaired. And so these are signatures of decreased mitochondrial function bioenergetics that in otherwise healthy people with no other markers of disease should give us some pause with respect to how we diagnose and the importance, of course, of activity as really the holy grail of metabolic health.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should provide, it certainly did myself, just a new way of looking at movement and it being something that contributes to the strength of your body in a different way, right? Something that's going to change the architecture of your most basic cellular component in asking your body to handle or to metabolize more fat and in a safer way. That's what you're doing with your mitochondria. You're really trying to create a much more structurally integral form of energy production that you would be otherwise. And so I just think it's a real profound study, and yeah, it's awesome. I really appreciate your conversation with us this morning, buddy.
Yeah, me as well, John. And it mechanistically it provides a window into why it is that someone who has yet to be diagnosed with prediabetes, or someone who has been diagnosed with prediabetes can reverse that by incorporating more activity into a healthy lifestyle. I mean, it works profoundly well. This is just more mechanistic evidence that at every stage of the life continuum, we need to remember where we've come from and how we are designed to function in relationship to the environments that we're in. So comes back to sort of the same blocking and tackling.
It does. It
and
does.
and it also helps, I think, to motivate this perception that not having uh, 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 an asterisk next to your blood work does not necessarily mean you're exactly where you want to be. So those are good points of emphasis.
Absolutely.
John, pleasure as always to connect. In the near future, we've talked about looking at this importance of acid loading in our diets and our ability to manage those acid loads, and why that's important in terms of disease risk, disease management, quality of life, et cetera. And so it'll be fun to have that discussion, John.
Yeah, that'll be great. I look forward to it.
For listeners, all of this will be on our website, thehealthedgepodcast.com. We're on all the other sort of podcast media outlets. We greatly appreciate your tuning in. And if this is information of value, please share with those you love. And don't forget to love yourself. And John and I will see you very soon.
See you later, Mark. Love you, brother.
Love you too, John.